Thank you. Welcome. As Shane said, this is As Advertised, Copyright and Test Development. So we'll first talk about copyright from a broader perspective, and then we'll talk about how those broader concepts affect copyright as it relates to secure tests. So what is my role at Alpine? I have been managing editor at Alpine for slightly over 2 years. I have a BA in professional writing. So as an editor, I look at the items from both a psychometric and a grammar standpoint, and I tailor it to the audience, which would be the candidates. I also have a Juris Doctorate, and much like doctors, lawyers are becoming very specialized. So during law school, I focused on copyright law and intellectual property, also called geek law. After law school, I worked for a large publisher handling permission requests. So I have a perspective from both sides of the copyright issue. This is just a little overview of what we're going to cover today that was on our website. The caveat here is that I'm speaking based on Alpine's client needs and my personal experiences. So your needs and experiences may be different. The goal here is just to take some of the mystery out of the process so that you're prepared to be proactive. Just a couple basics about copyright. How long does copyright last? So for works that are works for hire, in general, the topic can be complicated, but for works created after 1978, if you have a secure test that was created after 1978, which most of us do, then it'll last 95 years from publication or 120 years from creation, whichever comes first. And so we'll also talk about with copyright, publication is not required to get copyright, only fixation. And so we'll talk about what that little minimal requirement is for fixation later. So what is copyright law international? Copyright law is not international, but there are international treaties that extend copyright protection throughout the world. And the Copyright Office does have Circular 38A that provides some more details on that. So there are some advantages of copyright, and the basic advantage of copyright is that official copyright means that ownership is a basic fact before litigation occurs, and this is a good thing. There are some things that aren't included in copyright. One of the things that isn't included is formatting. The Copyright Office will not protect your formatting. So essentially this means that it doesn't really matter whether on the copyright application you specify print or electronic format for your assessment. The literary representative or the lit rep likes to know this information because it helps them anticipate what they'll be looking at during the visit, but otherwise it doesn't make a difference. At least that's what I've been told by the literary representatives that I've met. Public domain is also not included in copyright. Things that are in the public domain include legislation. So for example, if you're taking an image from the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can do that because it's legislation that is in the public domain. It's government material. There's also some other material that has fallen into the public domain because the copyright has lapsed, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. Borrowed material is already copyrighted by someone else. You can't copyright it twice, and so you'll need to exclude this on your copyright application, which we'll also talk about later. Unoriginal content is also not included in copyright. Examples of that are calendars, height and weight charts, or tape measures and rulers, and this is because they basically just contain facts, and facts can't be copyrighted. So there are some disadvantages of the copyright process, and one of the disadvantages is that copyright is a public process, and so as people who make up secure tests, security is a huge concern for us. So after creating a secure test, why do we want to potentially expose our content? And so we need to balance this with security. Having said that, why is copyright important? Copyright is important because it limits the ability of others to reproduce, distribute, display, and create a derivative work. All of these restrictions are important, but for those of us in secure testing, what we really want to do is secure our legal rights for the future and keep our content secure at the same time. And so we're going to talk a little bit about best practices for doing that. So first of all, you really want to document your process. You also want to post a prominent notice of copyright ownership. And you want to monitor your items for borrowed material, for example, images. You also do want to obtain registration from the U.S. Copyright Office using their secure test process. So what should your copyright notice include? So our recommendation is to place a notice in a prominent place. According to the 1976 Copyright Act, copyright notice is not required. Having said that, I've never met a lit rep who didn't insist on seeing a notice placed in a prominent spot. Most likely, your copyright notice will be in some sort of front matter that the candidate sees before actually viewing any items. So when should you follow your application? Our process at Alpine involves a comprehensive quality check after all of our forms are finalized. So my approach is to schedule the visit to the Copyright Office just before the forms go live and after all changes have been made. This is because this reduces the likelihood of exposure to content, and also copyright needs to be made on the most final version of the assessment. Once you change anything on the assessment, the copyright no longer holds. And so that's why I make my visit just before the forms go live. This is a big question. How long will the copyright process take? So it varies depending on how many applications the Copyright Office is dealing with and whether there are any questions concerning your application. But generally 8 weeks from the date of your visit to the Copyright Office, you will receive your official documentation that you have copyright on that material. The Electronic Copyright Office, also known as ECO, has shorter processing times. So when is the effective copyright date? For secure tests, that date will be the date that you make your visit to the Copyright Office, because this is the date that the Copyright Office receives the last piece of the puzzle of your application, which is the deposit. Where does copyright fit into the process of test development? So Alpine offers a full spectrum of test development activities. The only service we don't provide is publishing, but we do work closely with our vendors to make sure that test happens successfully. And based on our previous discussion, it might seem like obtaining copyright fits in later in the item development process, but our experience has shown that moving it up to the developed content stage is ideal. This is because we can train the item writers to use original content as well as provide the sources for any borrowed material. And if the items do contain borrowed material, we'll need to address this before obtaining copyright and be sure to exclude borrowed material from the copyright application. So it's important to be proactive. The first thing you want to do is make sure that agreements with your SMEs grant the copyright to you as a work for hire. Essentially, this means that the items that the SMEs write are granted to you and you can use them in your assessments. You also want to have the right item writing tools so that item writers can insert the source of each image. If you don't have a tool that allows them to do that, the item writers might be less likely to indicate that the source, that the image is borrowed. You also want to have standards in place so that you can easily identify borrowed content. Our item writing tool allows us to upload images and view details of that upload, such as who uploaded it and any other relevant comments. You also want to encourage item writers to use original content wherever possible. This is just part of educating item writers, so we start out with good quality at the beginning. It doesn't have to be adjusted further along down the road. How can you maintain security? So Alpine has a tool development team that constantly works on developing tools. And we have an item writing tool that takes us through each stage of the process in a secure way, so that whenever we're looking at items, we're always doing this in the secure item writing tool. The main difference about the procedure for secure tests is that to make a required deposit, you make a personal visit to the Copyright Office and have the option of masking out or redacting content so that your items are not exposed. So the fact that I have an encrypted laptop means that as I travel to the appointment in DC, the complete test might be on my laptop, but my laptop is encrypted and the items are accessible only in the password-protected item writing tool. So if my laptop is stolen or if I lose it for some reason, no one will be able to access that content. So requirements for content, originality and fixation. We'll see that the originality requirement is very low, but in secure testing, just because a specific image in an item is not original to the assessment, there's also a concept called fair use that can be applied at the broader assessment level so that borrowed images can be used. So requirement number 1, originality. The circle on the left is not original. It just represents the fact that a circle is a circle. But making the small changes on the right makes the circle original. Probably, maybe, it depends. But this is just to show you that the threshold for originality is very low. So there was a Supreme Court case called Feist, and it involved a telephone book, where the court said that merely copying phone numbers is not creative. There's no originality in that. But if you're doing a Yellow Pages and you decide to organize those numbers according to types of food instead of just by alphabet, there is originality in that arrangement. So again, the threshold is fairly low for the minimal creative spark. And in another case, the court ruled that photography is most likely original because there are, as you can see in this picture, there are decisions that the photographer made according to angle and lighting, and the process of making these decisions constitutes originality for purposes of copyright. Having said that, there were 3 cases where you can use borrowed material, and one of those is lack of originality, which we just talked about, and there's 2 other ones. There's public domain and there's fair use, which we'll go into now. So this is a little appropriate for the Halloween month, but public domain is government material or another work, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that has fallen into the public domain and is no longer copyrighted. So on the left, the book Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is in the public domain. But you do have to be a little bit careful because on the right, that's also Frankenstein, but that's Boris Karloff's version of Frankenstein. And that version of Frankenstein is copyrighted. Another example is that William Shakespeare's work is all in the public domain. So here's the catch-all for using borrowed material in secure tests, and it is the concept of fair use. This is the exception for using borrowed material in a classroom or for educational purposes. Going by the 4-pronged test of fair use, the analysis would be that the purpose or the use of the assessment actually expands the field of the original text and increases the market for the original publisher. And moreover, the portion of the work that's used in a secure test is usually very minimal. And we keep items secure so that only the candidates instead of the general public use the items. Also, in many cases, licensure tests are meant to increase the safety of the public, so the tests are really for the public good. And all of these arguments have merit as to why fair use is used for using borrowed material fairly in secure assessments. But it's still important to document the whole process, and by that I mean keep track of how many images are borrowed in your assessment and why, for your purposes, fair use applies according to this 4-pronged test that we just went over. So there is a second requirement for copyright, and that is that it be fixed. The important thing about this second requirement is that fixed does not mean published. So when everything started to become computer-based, the question became, is storing the item in a computer, is that having it fixed? And the conclusion has been that indeed it is fixed once you write the item in the item writing tool. It could be fixed wherever the item is recorded, but for our purposes, we really only want to talk about how the item exists in the tool because that's the most secure way to keep the items. So now that we talked a little bit about the basics of copyright, we'll talk about how the actual copyright functions. The Copyright Office does offer sort of a lecture series called Copyright Matters, and it's an effort to promote discussion or promote education among the public. The Copyright Office also recently reorganized itself based on increased public interaction. So they've made a commitment to better assist the public and provide more innovative services. They very recently appointed the Director of Public Information and Education, and they also appointed their first Public Information Officer. Their goal was to successfully navigate the copyright technology landscape of the 21st century. So we may be seeing some different ways that the Copyright Office handles itself in the future. So the Copyright Office, it is a huge task for the Copyright Office to handle all of these applications. So because they want to be consistent, the Copyright Office generally communicates through circulars. Even if you do get someone on the phone when you call the Copyright Office, it's likely you'll just be referred back to a circular. I suspect that the reason is that circulars provide consistent guidance, even if that guidance isn't always very clear, whereas the literary representatives have their own preferences that they execute within the overall process. So now we'll talk a little bit about the application, and part one of that is the online form. We talked a little bit before, or I referred to it with the Electronic Copyright Office, and there are some advantages to filing online. There's a lower cost, faster processing time, and you can track your application better. You also get receipt that the application is received. And they do have secure payment. The Electronic Copyright Office also does include some resources that might be helpful to you when you're filling out your application. So it does attempt to be user-friendly. So the website for ECO is copyright.gov. Internet Explorer and Firefox are recommended, and you'll also need Adobe Acrobat Reader. But as you'll see, it is a secure site with a password. This slide should give you just a general idea of the information that you'll need. For purposes of copyright, a secure test is called a literary work. So if your assessment is interactive, if it has a narrator or animation, like for preschool students, it might qualify as another type of work in addition to that. One note for filling out the application, once you've registered as a literary work, once you've filled that out in that first field, you can't change that because the rest of the questions follow that. The rest of the questions follow what type of work it is. So should you copyright your item bank versus your form? This decision is going to be specific to your processes for item development and publication. I did have the opportunity to speak with the chief deputy of the literary office, and she told me that once a change is made to any item in the bank, the copyright no longer holds on that bank. So if you have a process where you're constantly revising items, copyrighting the bank instead of the forms might not be ideal for you. But if you have a process where you're only revising, say every 3 months, you could get copyright for that 3 months and then get revised copyright once you revise all the items at the same time. So with respect to what should be listed as the author, in this context, the author is usually a work made for hire. That's a work especially commissioned, for example, for use as a test. And the client for Alpine is usually the author and the claimant of copyright. So this is just a little note on author created. So I received some guidance on what should be included in this from a literary rep recently, and this is the language that she came up with. For our purposes, for our clients, most of the time, the language of new and revised text and artwork in the author created field and new and revised text and artwork in the material included field will work. It's worth noting that these two sections, as noted by the twins on the slide, should be identical. So you can also exclude things on your copyright application. Artwork can actually be simultaneously included and excluded if it is somehow differentiated in the wording. So in the example on this slide, pre-existing differentiates borrowed artwork that is to be excluded, as well as any images that appear in items that have already been copyrighted. So there's also a limitation of copyright claim. In secure tests, items might be used on assessments year after year. If these items have been edited after they were originally copyrighted, they would qualify as different and therefore would not qualify as having already been registered. But if they are the same, I'm told that they should be excluded. The advice I have received specifically is that the specific items don't need to be listed, but a phrase such as previously registered text and artwork should be included. Just to be better safe than sorry, I do keep a list of items that are repeated from previous years, although I've never actually had to show that. So now we'll talk about part 2 of the application, which is the visit. And the visit is a significant difference in the Secure Test Copyright Office. The reason for this difference is to protect the security of the items so that only the lit rep sees the test content. So this is just the information for contacting the Copyright Office. I've never actually spoken to a real live person on this number, but if you leave a voicemail with your contact information and the date that you would like an appointment, it is likely that you could get a call back in a few days, but also be prepared to make a follow-up call depending on their workload. So the purpose of the visit is both examination and deposit, and the underlying purpose is to maintain security so that you can control what you bring and who sees it. So you may bring the entire assessment to the visit on your laptop, but the only one who actually needs to see it is the lit rep. And at that, it can be a quick scan on your laptop just so that the rep sees what is included on the application. In other words, if you're asking to have text and artwork copyrighted, just so that the lit rep can see that the assessment includes both text and artwork. The lit rep does not need to see the details of every item. You can just scroll down on your screen on the computer. There is a secure test processing fee. Currently, it's $2.75 per hour, and it starts the first minute. So it's for any part of the hour. If you go into the second hour, if your visit is 60 minutes plus 1 minute, then it's 2 times $2.75 is the cost. So what should you bring? You need to bring a printed copy of your application, the complete test on your laptop, which will be returned to you, a deposit, which the Copyright Office will keep, and the secure test processing fee. So we work so hard to keep our items secure. How are we going to leave a sample of the test and still maintain the security of our items? The goal is to leave as little material as possible so that the content is not exposed. So in general, this means show that there is a beginning and an end, as well as identify that the assessment is what it is through, say, a cover page. At Alpine, we have tools to mask content so that only the page number and a few of the words in the middle of the page are visible. So part 1 of the visit is the examination by the lit rep. And this just happens on your laptop. You scroll through your assessment in your item writing tool. For printed examinations, 1 complete copy of the test is required. For database examinations, you can either do 1 complete copy or 50 unmasked pages. It's your preference depending on your needs. Part 2 of the visit is to make your deposit or sample. So this deposit is defined as a sufficient archival record of the test, and its sufficiency is determined by the literary division. So what is the deposit? The deposit could be a photocopy of the title page and a masked or blocked out last page showing what is being copyrighted. And by that I mean if the application includes an image and text, it needs to show just that an image and text are included. It doesn't have to show the entirety of that. Basically, they just want to see the beginning and the end. You don't have to release your content, and in fact, you shouldn't. And I'll show you how you don't release your content. So this is an example of notes from a previous slide that I had. And you can see that by allowing you to mask the content, the Copyright Office enables you to protect it. So you can see on the left where I have the unmasked content, you can see everything. And then where it's masked, you really wouldn't be able to tell what that assessment contains. Alternatively to masking it like this, you could do it like this. Again, you can't really tell what the content is, but that is considered a deposit for a secure test. And with that, this is our contact info, Shane's information and my information, and I will open it up to any questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. We've got a few questions. Excuse me. We've got a few questions already posted, and I would encourage everybody out there, if you'd like to continue posting, we have some extra time to answer those. The first one, and you may have to go back to slide 13, but it says, how long does it take to get a copyright notice?
Right. So That time will vary. To actually get your notice, it could take 8 to 10 weeks. However, the date on that documentation will be the date of your visit. And so if you've made that visit and made your deposit, left your sample, then you will be covered as of the date that you made your visit. And it's just a matter of getting the paperwork. Legally, that copyright will hold up as of the date of your visit.
Okay. Can you explain what you mean by borrowed content?
The borrowed content is essentially if you have an item writer who really liked a certain image from, say, a McGraw-Hill text, and they basically sort of flung to that image into your item. That's something that you would want to know. That doesn't mean you can't use it, but it does mean that you should know about it at the very least, so that you can at least, when you're making your fair use argument, you can say that you knew that it was borrowed and this is the reason why it was fair use.
Okay. Another question is, can images from other copyrighted material, like a textbook, be used on a test under the fair use provision, even if one does not have express written permission from the copyright holder?
My understanding is that yes, that you can consider that fair use. And the reason for that is most of the time you could be talking about thousands of items, and realistically you only have a few images borrowed from that publisher. And so if it's only a few, you can claim it as fair use. If you're stealing the entire book, then there might be another issue, and I would recommend that you build relationships with publishers and perhaps establish an agreement with them, a friendly agreement with them, that it's acceptable for you to use their images without their permission or paying for permission. And that way you could use those images in that way as well.
Okay. Another question we have is, why mask content that is being registered with the Copyright Office? Is there a concern that the Copyright Office will not keep the test content secure?
Well, copyright is a public process. And so when you leave a deposit with them, this is a sample of, for the copyright purposes, of what is included in that assessment. And so you do not want to leave a sample of what is in the assessment without having it masked. The Copyright Office allows you to do that by masking it, and so you essentially don't want to leave your items unprotected.
Great, thank you. Another one says, has any certification program successfully prosecuted for copyright violation of exam content?
You know, I'm not quite sure the answer to that. I think the answer, I suspect the answer is no, but I'm not exactly sure. One of the reasons could be for that could be that the content is secure, so only the candidates are seeing it. So I'm not exactly sure how the publisher would be aware that their content is being used. But I can research that. I can research that and get back to whoever asked that question.
Great. Another one is, what is the advantage to actually registering your copyright?
So the advantage is basically that it provides a legal fact, and the legal fact is that you own the copyright to that, and that'll be established before any litigation were to begin.
All right. Is it recommended that every version of an exam be copyrighted?
That will depend. Well, you know, I would say I would recommend that every version be copyrighted. Sometimes you're publishing very similar, you're using very similar content, but I still think a best practice would be to get copyright every single time, as long as you do it in the secure way that I described.
Okay. That is the last question that we have right now, but we still have a number of folks on the call. So if there are any other questions out there, we do have some extra time. So I'll give it just 30 seconds or so to see if Anybody has anything pop up? How, let's see here. I think this is supposed to say how do we, basically how do we work through the copyright process for adaptive exams?
That is a very that is a complicated question that I would actually seek out some guidance for actually at the Copyright Office, and I think that they could provide you much more specific guidance for that.
So Pam, if you'd like to reach out to me or to Jennifer, just use one of the email addresses on the screen, and we'd be happy to get you some more information there. Can you file for copyright with a list of item numbers rather than actual examples?
I've never, in speaking with the literary representatives, I've never had an instance where they suggested that I do that. They've always insisted that when I list on the application what is included, meaning images and text, they've always insisted on seeing the image, that there is an image and a text. And I'm not sure how they would do that if they didn't actually see the content instead of just the item numbers. Having said that, I'm always calling the copyright and pretending as though I've never done it before and asking very basic questions just to sort of get someone's take on it. And so they might have a different answer to that.
Let's see here. We so the question is, how long has the fee for the visit been? Not sure exactly. Zach, if you might want to rephrase your question for me. I can't quite understand exactly what you're asking there. So I think that, Jennifer, you kind of mentioned something about basically they start billing it on the first minute that you walk in the door.
Yes.
And Zach's asking something about basically how long that visit usually takes and what, maybe explain some more about what the costs are just with your experience.
Okay, so the application fee, there's an application fee when you file online. I believe that's $55. And then when I go to do the visit, I generally, this isn't, it's not necessary to do this, but what I do is I use one application for, I could have 100 forms. And if I put the broader title of the assessment, and then for my purposes, I list every form that I'm going to be copywriting. That's not necessary to do that, but for my record-keeping purposes, I like to know every single form that I'm going to be copywriting. And so I think that doing that, using only one application, saves money because chances are there's going to be less room for error in just one application, and they only have to review one application. So what happens is that I sit down in a little room with the lit rep in the Copyright Office, and I have my laptop in front of me, and I have each form in my item writing tool, and I can scroll down my item writing tool, and I have the forms in order, and then I have the deposit. And so I scroll down each form, and she takes the page for the deposit and turns that over, and then we go to the next form, and I have a little checklist. And I have copyrighted almost 100 forms in a test with the lit rep that lasted less than an hour. So it cost our client $275 for the visit.
Great. Here's one. Are Canadian copyright rules similar to the U.S.? Is that something that you have experience with?
So I don't have specific experience with Canadian copyright rules, but I would forward you to Circular 38A of the Copyright Office, which indicates, gives you a little bit more information about with which countries we have treaties that extend copyright law into Canada, and that'll give you a better idea of what kind of protection you'll be getting.
Okay. Here's one. What are some instances where test creators would need to be protected with a copyright? In other words, why is it a good idea to get tests copyrighted?
Well, I think just in terms of protecting yourself, I think that it gives the entity that created the secure test just that basic protection of you have the copyright before any litigation would occur, and that's just a basic protection. And then secure tests need to be secure anyway, and so this is basically just another way of saying leave my content where it is, and it cannot be used for any other purposes than what the entity that created the test has deemed it to be used for.
Can you, to add on to that a little bit, can you talk about some of the risks for not getting a copyright for an exam?
Well, it's sort of one of those things where it's just a basic thing that you should have that protection by the Copyright Office, despite the fact that you could potentially expose your content if you don't do it properly. Really, if you do the process properly, you're not exposing your content, and you have that added protection that the copyright is yours. And so, although you have to do it properly, there isn't a downside to it as long as you do.
Great. So this was something that you mentioned a little bit earlier. So it says if I register a large bank of items, say 500 items, and one item is later revised, the copyright on that bank of 500 is that rendered void? And if so, do I need to register copyright on just the revised items, or do I need to re-register the remaining 499?
Well, in that case, I would say it's just the one item. And so you could, I suppose, just get copyright on the one item. It depends on what your process is. A small change in the item, I think, would not make such a difference when you're talking about a bank of 500. That's my general feeling. Somebody at the Copyright Office might tell you something different, but if you're talking about something as small as one change out of 500, I don't see the need to make much effort to remedy that.
Okay. Are there copyright offices in multiple places or just in D.C.?
As far as I know, it's just D.C.
Okay. And then the question was basically asked, are there copyright services provided by Alpine? And I'll just say that, yes, I think that we can definitely help. But to broaden it and to not turn this as much into a sales call and more of an education, Jennifer, can you just talk about services that somebody might be able to get from Alpine or from another vendor as well? Just keep it a little more broad.
Sure. So basically, our copyright services are that we monitor it. As I said before, as I described our process, we monitor it from the very beginning. We incorporate the copyright process into our test development process, so that from the very beginning when items are created, we're trying to add that extra protection of looking for borrowed content, recording the borrowed content, and then at the end, when we make our visit and we get the official copyright documentation, we're able to say what should be included and what should be excluded. And then we provide that documentation to our clients.
Great. Are there any other questions out there? I think that we've pretty much got to the end of this list. Just give another couple of minutes here to see if there's any that come through. None right now. What I will probably do is kind of wrap this thing up, at least from this presentation's perspective. Is, again, the two email addresses that you're seeing on your screen right now. If it's services that you're looking for, please feel free to reach out to me. If it's a follow-up question specifically related to copyright stuff, I'm definitely not the person that can help you, but Jennifer definitely is. We have a webinar coming up in November that will be monitoring exam data with your credential management system. We'll be taking a look at some standard reports that you can pull out of your credential management system and how you can help your program by using those reports. And with that being said, if there's no other questions, we will close the webinar for this month. And again, I will send out an email within the next 48 hours or so with links to our website and also a link to register for next month's webinar as well. I'd like to thank Jennifer for helping us out today, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and we hope to see you next month. Have a great day.
Thanks, Shane.